Good afternoon. I'm Richard Gigline, and I'd like to welcome you to the latest in our Compensation Committee webinar series titled Compliance and Communication, the Dynamic Duo of Disclosure. In the years since Dodd-Frank, the compensation and disclosure analysis documents have undergone a sea change in both requirements and communication styles. This single critical document must address increasingly complex compliance issues and at the same time connect the dots between compensation strategy, business performance, and pay outcomes. It must clearly explain these points to multiple audiences, including employees and the media. There is no single answer or template, but today we'll explore ideas that will help companies effectively tailor their CD&A to deliver the right balance of compliance and public communication. Our discussion will be led by a team from Perlmeyer and Partners New York office, Managing Director Deborah Lifshey and Vice President Sharon Podstupka. Before we turn over the program, let me have Ron Perry come on. He's with NACD's education team, and he'll go over a few housekeeping announcements.
Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. At any time during our live presentation, you, a viewer, can submit your questions and comments in the chat box below. You can also download additional resources and find useful links. Please click Download the presentation for a copy of the slides. Also, slides will be available at perlmeyer.com/dynamic duo. This presentation viewed live is worth 1 skill-specific credit applied to our NACD fellowship programs. If you'd like more information, please follow the email address on the screen. Again, a replay of the slides will be available on NACD's website and perlmeyer.com early next week. Deborah, on to you.
Well, thank you, and thank you, Richard, for the introduction, and thank you all for being on this call today. It's great to see such a good turnout, especially on a topic that we've seen before. The topic of disclosure we address pretty much on an annual basis, and this year when we were setting it up, we were a little worried that maybe you've all seen it before, and we spiced it up with a little Batman reference, which is our dynamic duo. What you don't know is Sharon and I are sitting in a conference room fully garbed as Batman and Robin now, and I will try to hold back the holy disclosure references or call outs to Alfred's emergency bat buckle bat call signal, and we'll get started. We really have been through a lot of disclosure. This is our 8th year, if you could believe it, under the SEC's expanded disclosure rules. So we've been following these rules essentially in the same matter with a few tweaks here and there along the way for 8 years. So really this entire disclosure exercise started out as a practice that was mandated by the SEC, and our audience was the SEC. And if you can believe it, this is now our 5th year of SayonPay. We're going into our 5th season, so we have 4 whole years to look at to see what our shareholders are voting for, what they're voting against, what they like in compensation programs, and what they don't like, which is largely dictated by how they're reading it in the proxies. So we've gone from an audience of really largely regulatory people looking at these proxies to an audience of investors and shareholders and the media focusing on the proxies. So it's a constantly evolving topic. Disclosure every year changes in sometimes slight ways and sometimes rather dramatic ways. And so we'll look at trends over the years, we'll look at how things are changing, and we'll look at what people are focusing on for the upcoming proxy season. Just to take a step back in terms of audience, just wanted to point out that at the beginning of all of this, back in 2007, the SEC has a review process. It reviews larger companies every 3 years, or every 1 year, and all public companies every 3 years in terms of disclosure. At the beginning of this practice, we saw a multitude of comment letters issued that companies were not following the rules, they weren't providing enough disclosure, they weren't providing disclosure that answered the question about targets, rationale, and why payments were made. If we fast forward to 2014, we see almost no comment letters being issued, at least with compliance on the disclosure on the compensation-related side. So really, our regulatory audience at this point is satisfied. What we're now focused on is our investors, and it's become, as most of you have seen in the past few years with SayonPay, sort of a marketing vehicle. With that, let's just briefly look at what we're covering today. Our first topic is SayonPay results. No discussion of disclosure would ever be complete without seeing how we're doing, how are our investors viewing our compensation, how are we disclosing it, are we disclosing it in a light that's positive enough to garner at least 50% of the vote, in most cases closer to 70 or 90% of the vote. Sharon will also focus on disclosure trends and the constant evolution of the proxy statement. As painful as it is, we do need to cover in this session the regulatory updates. Some of them are minor, some of them will impact this upcoming proxy statement in very important ways. So we'll go through the SEC changes, we'll go through major proxy advisory changes, and we'll even go through an accounting board change, which for the first time is really focusing in on compensation, and it could impact disclosures this year. And finally, we'll turn it over to Sharon, our communications expert, to talk about putting pen to paper, where to get started in the drafting process, and what would be the guiding principles as we enter 2015. So if we could turn the slide now. We'll jump right into SayonPay Outcomes. And just for your reference, after this webinar is over, there's an appendix in the back that has even more statistics that you could take a look at if you really get into this stuff. The benefit of looking at SayonPay this year is that we now have 4 years of data to look at. And over 4 years, there are some constant themes. And one of the constant themes is that companies are passing, and they're passing by a lot. And only a handful of companies over the years have failed. As a general matter, only about 2%, high 1s to 2% fail each year. It's a handful of companies. This year, we're up to 60 of the roughly 3,000 companies that we have tracked. And companies are passing by a lot. On average, they're all passing by about 90%. So we're getting healthy, good returns on most companies. What we also know as a general trend over 4 years is that ISS typically votes against 10% of the plans that are put on the ballot. And what impact this typically has is it lowers the passing rate by about 23 to 26% over the years. So ISS has an impact. However, the impact is not determinative of the voting outcome. As you can see here, shareholders went along with ISS recommendations in only 17% of these votes. So getting an against vote from ISS is bad, but it's not death. You can certainly get around it by trying to do some shareholder outreach, looking at your other major shareholders, and appealing to their policies if they're not strictly following ISS. One question I get asked a lot when we're talking about, we tend to focus on ISS because that's the proxy advisory service with really the most amount of influence on institutional investors. What about Glass Lewis? Glass Lewis is also out there. It has its own set of policies. And as a general matter over the years, we find that the roughly 25 to 30% differential impact ISS can have on a company by voting against the SayonPay on the ballot, Glass Lewis only has a 10% impact. So a little bit less, but nonetheless influential if you're really on the border between passing and not passing. So let's move on to the next slide. And now we have a comic strip for you to break the tension.
Thanks, Deb. I'm going to actually move this over. I think what's really interesting here is not only do we have the advantage of 5 years behind us with respect to data and understanding how organizations have been doing, we also know that over the last 5 years we're at a bit of a disadvantage because investors, proxy advisors, and the media have all become pretty adept at tracking executive pay issues. And one audience that Deb didn't mention when we kicked this off is employees. And we know that even employees are paying more attention to how executives are being rewarded. So whether we like it or not, SayonPay results do have meaning, and they send signals about the way boards are making decisions about pay. So to this end, what we know is the pressure to do a better job of developing really good CD&As, and I have my finger quotes around really good, is at its highest since the inception of Dodd-Frank. So what is a really good CD&A? The expectation is that CD&As not only include SEC-required information, but also explain in an easy-to-read fashion how a company's business strategy and results align with the decisions that the Compensation Committee has made about pay. For that reason, boilerplate language simply isn't effective anymore, which takes the drafting process to a completely new level, which I'll talk about a little later in the webcast. But first, what I'd like to do is take a look at how we've seen the content evolve. So if we could go to the next slide. What I'd like to do here is share with you some information we've gathered from recent research on trends in executive compensation practices. And this is taken from Perlmutter and Partners survey on 2015, looking forward, looking ahead to executive pay in 2015. So as part of this survey, which has lots of questions, we purposely asked a series of questions about how companies were planning to change their CD&As for the coming year. The common theme that we can see here is that content does continue to grow, especially in areas where the narrative has to be original. So that is, key messages in all of these areas will be unique to each company. So as you can see here at the top, most companies today include an executive summary in their CD&A, and there are really only a few stragglers left who are planning to add one this year. And then I think we've got everybody on board with that quote-unquote best practice. Similarly, companies are also explaining their engagement efforts, and those who haven't yet are also planning to do so this year. What's new is that we can see that almost 30% are going beyond just explaining their efforts, but connecting what they heard to how they are responding. And most companies, even in the absence of final regulations, are adding alternative descriptions of pay that the Comp Committee thinks do a better job of showing how they came to their pay decisions, for example, through a realized or realizable pay illustration. This also includes growing trends of graphics that highlight how executive pay is aligned with performance relative to peers. What's not on this slide, but I think important to note, is that many respondents also indicated that they plan to add enhanced descriptions of the Comp Committee's decision-making process, as well as discussions around goals and performance. I think the good news here, although it seems like a lot more work, is that companies have a very good opportunity to make their CD&A narratives their own. The bad news is that it adds to the complexity of the drafting process, and if not done in a carefully planned way, we could end up with very long CD&As that make it hard for readers to find the information that they're looking for, which we know can be an irritant. This makes clear and concise language critical in the process. So what I'd like to do here is stop for a moment and take our first poll. I'm wondering if there's a slide. There it is. So the question is, my company's SayonPay vote has influenced the writing style of our CD&A. So I think you can just click in one of the radio buttons and submit your answer, and we'll see what the audience thinks.
You know, Sharon, as people are voting, I just wanted to talk about one thing you did mention, which is more focus on the decision-making process. Now, I've seen a lot of CD&As over the years that have gone into ad nauseum detail about something first went to the committee, then they went to the board, then they came back to the committee, then they went through the management process, and it almost talks logistically about how decisions were made. Do you think that that is at all helpful or can ever enhance a CD&A?
I think that it does, and I think it depends on the organization and what their situation is. I think some companies have gotten feedback that the way they use discretion isn't clear, and in some cases that helps make more clear that the committee has an assessment process, a framework by which they're making decisions, and it can help. So do we have our, there we go. So in our poll, so CD&A compensation discussion and analysis, it seems that 40% 6.3% of folks say that their company's SayonPay vote has influenced the writing style of their CD&A. We're currently working on a survey now that's live that actually shows that number as much higher. It's almost in the 80s. So I find that really interesting. So we'll see how this continues to roll out as we have our discussions. With that, I will turn it back to Deb.
Great, and I think we're on the next slide now. So let's move on to a topic which is near and dear, I'm sure, to many of you, and some of us not so dear, but let's talk about pay ratio. As you all know, pay ratio was a rule that came out in 2010, incorporated as part of the Dodd-Frank Act, and nobody touched it for many years to put any teeth into it, to give it guidance. We didn't really know what it meant. We know we have to talk something about the CEO's pay, we have to find a median employee, and we have to show a ratio between the two. Well, over a year ago, back in September of 2013, the SEC came out and it did issue some proposed regulations. We thought by now regulations would be final, and this rule would be effective for proxies issued in 2016, so it would cover compensation for this coming year, for 2015 compensation. But here we are, November 18th, and there are no final rules. There were all sorts of rumors over the summer. It was coming over the summer, and then there was a rumor it would come by Halloween, happy trick or treat, but it hasn't come yet. We don't know where it is on the SEC agenda, but most people are presuming it will be out before the end of the year, which would make it applicable by 2016. So proposed rules came out over a year ago, and like Robin would say, it's all a blur, like a horrible daymare. So what did we find out from those proposed rules? The first thing, which is really good news for many companies, is there's a lot of flexibility in the rule. There's no specific methodology proposed, and companies really have to decide how they're going to select the population covered and how wide they will cast their net when looking at different groups of employees. Right now, the rules say you start with the general population. Nobody gets excluded. This was sort of a surprise, but the SEC was bound by the legislative language to not provide exclusions for part-time people or international employees, making this a particular hardship for global companies. It covers only those individuals who are employed on the last day of the fiscal year, so could impact different companies differently depending on how many seasonal employees they might have at the end of their fiscal year. You can't annualize part-time employees or seasonal employees. You can only annualize those part-time, full-time workers who were employed at some point during the year. And, of course, there's no cost of living adjustment or international equalization. So the SEC basically is disregarding what goes on in other countries and saying, this is what Congress dealt us, this is the language, and this is as much flexibility as we can give you in interpreting the language. So if we move on to the next slide, let's dig down a little bit into why this is important and why we're talking about it in a disclosure webinar. We know we have to disclose at a minimum CEO pay, and that's generally CEO pay as it appears in the summary compensation table, median employee pay, and the ratio between the two. In addition, we know at a very minimum we have to explain the methodology and estimate for calculating the ratio. However, the SEC is very clear that this should be brief. So this is not always an easy exercise, because if you have a vast population that's global and you need to really hone in on certain executives, on certain groups of employees that you think more fairly represent the median employee, you're going to have a lot of explaining to do as to why you're carving out those international employees or those part-time employees that you don't think should be part of this discussion. So while simple on its face, the rules and guidance and the proposed rules really almost complicate, because there are a lot of decision-making points. I think first you need to, when you sit down to do this as a company, you have to decide who's involved in the process. Will it start with HR? Will it start with finance and audit to figure out where employees are located? how much they're making, how they're calculated, and what access do you have to information. Some employees in certain countries, there's data privacy rules, and you might not even be able to get to some of the compensation data that you need. More importantly, in terms of disclosure, is who's your audience? How are you going to write this thing? We started out this webinar by talking about the fact that first the SEC was your audience, so you had to comply with the rules. Then with the advent of SayonPay, investors were your audience. But now you have not only those two bodies, but a bunch of other folks who are looking at this. You have your investors, and to date, I have not heard of any institutional investors that really care about this ratio, with the exception of perhaps, I think AFL-CIO, I think it might be valuable in some fashion. You'll have executives looking at it, but this is really not too much news for executives because CEO pay had always been disclosed, and we had access to other named executive officers in the proxy statement. You have, I'm going to skip over employees for a second because that's probably the most critical audience, which Sharon will address in a moment, but you have your proxy advisors, and I just wanted to point them out as a separate group because both ISS and Glass Lewis have said on an informal basis that they don't even know how they're going to use this pay ratio, and they don't know what use it will be. And most people can't figure that out. Probably one of the scariest audiences is going to be the media because there really hasn't been much change in the disclosure rules in the past few years. Everybody's gotten over the excitement of SayonPay, and this is a really hot button for the media to hit. Not necessarily in terms of what the number is, but I think it will be used more in a fashion that compares company to company, industry to industry. So you have to be careful how you're going to disclose the ratio and what it means to the media and how they'll focus in on it. And that's a really important message.
There is no requirement at this time to put that disclosure into the 2014 fiscal year report, is there?
No, so the proxy that's going to be filed in spring of 2015 reflecting 2014 compensation does not require this. At the earliest, this disclosure would be required in spring of 2016 with respect to 2015 comp. So its applicability is coming up because it will be looking at compensation paid within 2 months, but the reporting obligation won't happen for over another year. And finally, employees. The disclosure about median employees, we've never seen this before, about Joe employee. And this Joe employee, as Sharon will talk about, no relation to Joe the plumber. This Joe employee is not self-employed. He's probably pretty liberal. He's a corporate journeyman. And for the first time, he's going to see how he compares to his peers, other employees, not just named executive officers. So all of these people you have to keep in mind when you're thinking about how detailed do I want to be, how brief do I want to be, do I want to just include the bare bones, or do I want to take action up front to confront some of the issues that may be raised by the media? Do I want to be very clear about why it's important for me to exclude all of the international employees and part-time employees and why that simply doesn't reflect my workforce? So with that, I'm going to turn to another fun cartoon with Sharon.
Thanks, Deb. I think what we can say here, we're on slide 12 for those of you out there listening, that we know that there are no big fans of the CEO pay ratio among us, but unfortunately we know that it's here to stay. And beyond the mountains of work, just to get to the number, there's one more thing that we really do need to be thinking about and get ahead of, and it's not just about executive pay anymore. The fact is that for the last 5 years, any employee could open their proxy and find their CEO's pay and that of the other named executive officers. And if he or she was smart enough, could probably easily figure out the difference between what he or she makes and the CEO. What hasn't been as easily accessible today is Joe employees' pay. So I like to think about this in 2 ways. One, with the introduction of the pay ratio and anyone getting a hold of Joe employee's salary, we know that the media is going to jump all over this, and there's a high likelihood that more people will pay attention to the numbers. Number 2 is that we know that employees already do not trust their employers with respect to pay. In fact, a recently released industry survey told us that a whopping 50% of employees do not believe that they are being paid fair as compared to the other people in similar positions at their companies. And the reason for it, what backed that up, was that employees went on to say that their companies just don't do a good job of explaining their pay programs. So there's little transparency around how pay is set and adjusted, especially in comparison to internal peers. So if we put these two things together, we have a recipe for some real employee engagement issues. I think the good news with the timing is that we've got a good runway to get ahead of it. And not with respect to the proxy disclosure itself, but how organizations are talking about pay internally across their populations. So once the disclosures are made public, at least there's some context for people about how they are paid relative to Joe employee and potentially those at the top of the house. So,
an interesting side remark I would make, back in the early 70s, I was working for a major U.S. corporation in New York City that literally gave every single employee a card, a plastic card, that had all the job grades and all the rate ranges within those grades. And so it was pretty easy for you to kind of figure out where you were. The net result in that company, which was huge, there was very little dialogue or discussion at all about compensation. Everybody pretty well knew what everybody made, all the way from the CEO all the way down to the very lowest entry level.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. You know, what I've seen and what I've experienced over the last several years with employers they're really struggling with that transparency issue that didn't seem to be there that long ago. And if you look at any industry magazine today, there's typically an article, even in the papers, about pay inequality and questions about how transparent an organization should be with respect to pay grades and job levels and how it works. I think with the introduction of the pay ratio and the potential for this to be, great fodder for the media, it becomes an even more important strategic issue for boards and management to discuss, so everybody sort of understands what not only the story is externally to the market, but what the story is internally to employees, so they're not feeling disenfranchised. So with that, I'm going to open up the line for our next polling question, and this should be interesting. So our second poll here is, how concerned are you about your employee population's, reaction to your CEO pay ratio? I wonder if we've got some results, Ron. Somewhat concerned, not at all concerned, very concerned. Well, it's good to see that some of you are very concerned. I think that it'll be interesting to see how things play out over the next 6 to 10 months and whether or not those numbers grow. I can tell you that, having had lots of conversations and conferences over the last, I would say, 90 days, the issue is definitely bubbling to the surface. So I thank you for your responses. And with that, let's go on to the next slide. And I will turn it back to Deb to talk to us about regulations.
Oh, holy regulation, we're back. So again, I wanted to point out that in the appendix we have some painful detail if you want to know a little bit more about what's still pending and out there under the Dodd-Frank Act, the compensation-related provisions. As many of you know, there's a whole lot of other issues out there outside of compensation that are still unsettled under Dodd-Frank. So SEC is pretty busy, but this is what we know about what's happened with the compensation-related provisions. We started out with about 11 of them, and we're down to 4 that have not been settled and finalized. We've already discussed the pay ratio. We're waiting for those final regulations. And what we have nothing for yet are pay for performance, clawbacks, and hedging and pledging. However, interestingly enough, I think most people would agree that in some format, each of these items is discussed in almost every CD&A I see now. Pay for performance really started to be a hot topic when SayonPay came into play, because our favorite institutional shareholder services, ISS, has their own pay for performance formula that you could run, and you can get a pretty good indicator of whether or not you will obtain favorable voting results from ISS. And so what most companies did, or most companies who care about obtaining ISS favorable recommendations, is they put some sort of pay for performance analysis right in their proxy. And we would usually see it right in the executive summary. And this pay for performance disclosure would, to the extent that it showed it was advantageous to companies, track the ISS model, which would compare CEO pay to total shareholder return over set periods of time. To the extent that the CEO pay was not tracking or running in parallel with total shareholder return, companies would try to tell another pay for performance story. But in any event, we had this conversation in the CD&A, and we've had it for about 5 years, about how executive pay is tracking important compensation elements. Executive pay is tracking some performance, either financial metric or TSR in the proxy. Clawbacks. This is an interesting one. Clawbacks, as you know, back with Sarbanes-Oxley, clawbacks became a hot topic, and the Sarbanes-Oxley clawback only provides for recruitment if there's bad acts, and it's recruitment of money paid in incentive compensation paid in the last 12 months, and it's limited to the CEO and CFO. So it's a very limited clawback provision. What Dodd-Frank contemplates is much broader. It's current executives, former executives. There's a 3-year look back. You don't have to be a bad actor. There just has to be a material misstatement. So what we've seen is I guess it really started with Dodd-Frank. We've seen an abundance of companies disclosing the fact that they have a clawback and or they will enact a clawback when Dodd-Frank, we have final rules under Dodd-Frank. So we really see it, I think, in most proxies now. The question is, how tough is the clawback and how much would it actually comply with Dodd-Frank or the Dodd-Frank rules that we believe will be released? So the devil's really in the details, but I would say at the very minimum, you have some section in most proxies now that talk about the fact that there is a recoupment policy, and by the way, you also score some ISS points in some of their testing models for the presence of a clawback. Hedging and pledging, again, this is another one we don't have specific guidance on, but most companies already have embedded in their insider trading policies some sort of anti-hedging and pledging provision. So we don't have final rules on these. They'll probably change the manner in which they're disclosed when we do have final rules, but they are being disclosed in some fashion today. So if we could move on to the next page. ISS. Every year, as most of you know, ISS issues policy updates, and they issue policy updates on a variety of topics. This year, the hot topic was how ISS will vote on equity plans that are up for shareholder approval. As most of you know, back in 2003, companies were no longer allowed to just issue equity to executives without obtaining shareholder approval, and that became a rule of the New York Stock Exchange and the NASDAQ. So you have to put your plan up for approval. If your plan does not get approved by shareholders, you no longer have equity left to grant your employees, and you'll have to find another way to compensate them, which is really not a very good result. Usually companies take their plans back to shareholders every 3 to 5 years, and by that time, most of the plans are tapped. So if you're stuck getting ISS recommends against you, your shareholders follow ISS recommendation on equity plans, it could be a real disaster. In the past, when ISS looked at equity plans, they would simply focus on plan costs. That is, how costly is it, how dilutive is the plan to current shareholders? And it would look at shares that were being requested as well as outstanding options in equity. This year, ISS changed the policy. They had a policy survey out there, and institutional investors as well as companies responded, and they found that these groups of folks were also interested in seeing some sort of review of grant practices and plan features as much as they were interested in seeing the cost of the plan. So ISS now has 3 prongs to look at, and we'll get a little bit into those. But first, I just wanted to talk about the threshold, things you don't want to have in your plan or disclose about your plan and your proxy when you're going for shareholder approval. These are what ISS considers toxic features and could really result in ISS ultimately voting against the plan even if the cost is okay. The first thing is they don't want to see awards, options, restricted stock automatically vesting in connection with a liberal change of control definition. And what is that? That's any kind of change of control that really doesn't finalize and consummation of the deal. So the deal actually has to happen. Any plan that permits repricing or cash buyout, that's been a no-no for a long time. And in fact, under the exchanges, you really can't do that either. They don't want to see any of their problematic pay practices or going back to their pay for performance disconnect if they see that CEO pay is really out of line with total shareholder return. They could vote against your plan. And I have this in italics because this is my favorite one. Any other plan feature determined to have a significant negative impact on shareholder interest. And to which I can only say, holy discretion. That's a lot of discretion with ISS. We don't know what it means, but we do know that if ISS doesn't like something, they can really ding you on your equity plan. So quickly going through the new 3 prongs. We have plan cost. This used to be weighted at 100%. Now we're down to 45%. It measures what's called the shareholder value transfer. There's going to be 2 parts of this. First, it's going to be the new shares requested plus remaining for future grants plus outstanding. They will also focus only on new shares, and we don't know what the balance is going to be between their focus on new shares and all shares, but they will be coming out with a technical document in December. We understand that should provide a little bit more clarity on that. If we can move on to page 15. The next category, this is a new category, and it's grant practices. I say it's new lightly because really these are items that have been sort of in the bonnet of ISS for many years. It's clear that they don't like really high burn rates and they have caps on burn rates. It's clear that they don't like really quick vesting of CEO grants, and they don't like purely time-based grants. So all of these things listed here, we won't read through all of them, can result in not necessarily an against vote, but in the grand scheme of however all of these numbers mesh together, it could lower the points that you get for ISS voting in favor. And as you can see here, tying back to what we talked about earlier with your clawback policy, you know, whether your disclosure contains a clawback policy or whether your plan contains a clawback policy can garner positive points. So, you know, our advice is put something in. Maybe it's a clawback light. Maybe it's something that's highly discretionary with the committee, but check that box with ISS. Plan features. Again, these are features that are within the 4 corners of your plan and the 4 corners of your disclosure description in your proxy. What ISS will be looking for. No surprises. These are things they've hated for many years, but now they'll ding you on the equity plan proposal. Any kind of single trigger award vesting upon change of control. So this means that a company undergoes a change of control, the new co assumes all my equity, and automatically on the day that the transaction is consummated, I vest up in everything, I own everything, and I have no more skin in the game. ISS does not like that. We don't know to what degree they don't like it. We don't have a technical document. We don't know if there will be carve-outs, if there's a cash buyout, or the equity is not assumed, but we'll find that out in December. One thing that is really a little troubling is they don't like discretionary plan voting within the document, and almost every equity omnibus plan I read has the authority vested in the committee to make discretionary vesting. Maybe it's upon a retirement of a founder or a long tenured employee. That discretionary vesting is a really important flexibility feature. And again, you know, other things that they don't like, liberal share recycling. So things like when I exercise, I use some of the exercise options to pay the price for the option, or for withholding taxes, that would not count against the total number available under this plan. They don't like that, and they also want to see minimum vesting periods for grants made under plans. So in the past, the good governance features we've typically seen are for performance-based restricted stock awards, they want to see at least 1 year, and for time-based, the rule of thumb really is 3 years. All right, if we can move on. Page 16, please. Just quickly, the minor other policy updates. The good news is the pay for performance test, which is sort of this complicated test, again, about how does your TSR relate to your CEO pay over time. That hasn't changed, and this is the first time in several years it's just remained constant. Two things that have changed on a compensation-related front under Quick Score, which is how a big grid or scorecard about how ISS views governance practices. Two changes there, and you could read them, but they were put in place mostly to align with the current pay for performance test as well as the new equity plan proposal test. Moving on to page 17. And this is Glass Lewis, ISS's smaller, younger cousin who's much less influential, Glass Lewis. They have their own policies, and in a way it's almost a little bit harder to get at how Glass Lewis will be voting because you can't purchase a lot of modeling from them. With ISS, you can purchase what's called the Compass model, and you can test whether or not your equity plan should garner ISS support. You can buy the model, and you could speak with one side of the ISS house and to try to figure out whether the side that will eventually be voting will vote in favor of your plan. Glass Lewis doesn't really have that methodology or availability, so you just have to get a copy of their policy and pick and choose which policies you're able to follow and what makes sense for your company. This year, for the first time, they came out with a statement, though, on one-off compensation awards. So say you have a regular long-term cycle and you've been following it, and you have your base, your short-term, and your long-term cycle, and something happens at your company and it turns out that neither your short-term nor your long-term plans will result in any payouts if you're strictly following it. And your company decides that because of the particular state it's in, at this point, in order to retain the management team, they have to do a one-off award of equity or cash or long-term program. And as a general matter, Glass Lewis does not like that. They think it interrupts the continuity of programs and there's no reason for it. And how this ties back to disclosure is they say, but if you can provide a cogent and convincing explanation of its necessity, maybe we won't vote against you. So again, another way in which disclosure is just so critical to obtaining proxy advisory votes and shareholder votes. And really, even if Glass Lewis weren't on the table, if you had a one-off award, you should be explaining the rationale and how this program will tie back to the regular program and whether it's in lieu of the regular program going forward. All right, if we could move on to the next slide. Well, we should have broken this up with some of Sharon's comics here. let's get all the pain over with, shall we? So the next thing is, if there's anything drier than talking about Dodd-Frank, we could talk about accounting. This came as a surprise to many of us. The PCAOB, this is the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board, was a not-for-profit corporation put in place by Congress after SOX, and it was put in place to oversee the slight irregularities in audits and protect investors that occurred post-Enron. And up until now, what the PCAOB had to say on compensation was that you need to review compensation programs, you need to talk to management, you need to understand them, and at the end of the day, you need to understand the most important question, which is, how does this tie back to risk? And do my compensation programs cause enough risk that it should be turned up in an audit review? And for the most part, the auditors came in and they relied on management's representation that these compensation programs pose no material risk. Well, this year, and effective for next year, the PCAOB came in and said there's going to be a new procedure. It will require you auditors to read employment and compensation contracts Not only that, but you have to read the proxy statement. And if you don't think the proxy statement is clear, you need to go in and get more clarity from the compensation committee or the compensation, or even worse for us, the compensation committee consultant. As an aside, you have to really understand the expense reimbursement policy. So if we think about what the impact of this is, if you really want to avoid getting into it with your auditors, and especially the compensation committee members on this phone or compensation consultants who are working, you really need to make sure your disclosure is clear and coherent and there's rationale. And in addition, you want to focus on Section 402S, which is what the SEC requires of companies to disclose about risk and executive compensation programs. They'll be taking a closer look at that. So you might want to think about making the section on compensation risk a little bit more fulsome. And finally, my last slide, page 19, SEC guidance on investment and proxy advisors. And I think this is a favorite for a lot of people to come in and say, how can ISS do this? How is it possible that ISS Glass Lewis has so much influence over the process, particularly when ISS has a consulting side of the business and they're making money on both sides of the house? How is this not a conflict? And what the SEC came in and said after many years of batting this around is, well, we can't really make rules on this, but we're going to issue a staff legal bulletin. And in essence, what the staff legal bulletin says is that investment advisors don't have to vote on every topic at every meeting, which cuts down on their need to rely on proxy advisories, which are the Glass Lewis and the ISS. Institutional investors must have their own policies and practices, and many of them do, and many of them don't follow ISS. And if they do employ a proxy advisor, they have to oversee the proxy advisor. So if the proxy advisor gets it wrong, if they have errors in their reports, the investors now have a duty to oversee the proxy advisor. And they give a little bit of guidance to the proxy advisors, and they say, look, you have two jobs if you don't want to be deemed a solicitor under the proxy rules and be subject to a whole other list of regulations. You can either just distribute your reports, or if you're doing more than distributing a report, you have to talk and disclose about the disclosure and relationship. And so what many people have concluded is this could dampen the impact of ISS consulting services. But I think for our purposes, at the end of the day, what's important is disclosure, disclosure, disclosure. The more you disclose to your investors, the more they could rely on your disclosure, understand your disclosure, without having to rely on proxy advisors for recommendations. And that is all I have on regulation. And I thank you very much, and I'm sure we'll see you same bat time, same bat channel next year. But let me turn it over to Sharon.
Thanks, Deb. So we're now on slide, I can't see the number there, I think it's 20. I need some bad glasses so I can see better. But I encourage you all listening to use the technology here and submit questions as you're listening if they come up. And if we don't get to them during our call today, we will certainly get back to you after the call ends. So I'm going to bring us to the big finish here after listening to Deb and thinking about how disclosure has evolved and what it means in terms of content and how much content may need to be developed as we move forward into the future. It's clear that, and in talking to many of you, that the compensation committee's role has certainly changed over the years. We know that effectively managing messages about executive pay has become a lot more intricate than it was 5 years ago. And the drafting and development process has gotten pretty complex. So simply stated, the Comm Committee's role has grown beyond a cursory review before the proxy is filed, and committees are, in my view, essentially now wearing three very different hats. So the first hat here I have is as a director, and I don't mean that as a board of director, but think of it more as a film director, and I have Alfred Hitchcock here. What we know about film directors is that they have teams who are responsible for executing on their vision for bringing stories to life. And it's up to the director to take charge to set the tone, the style, and perspectives on the primary storyline, and in the case of the CD&A, key performance themes. The next hat or role I see is as a referee. Not only is comp a complex and sensitive topic to begin with, as you all well know, but the number of internal folks who have gotten involved in crafting messages has grown exponentially. So we've got legal involved, we've got human resources folks involved, in some cases corporate communications, finance, investor relations, and probably your independent compensation consultant. So this makes the development and delivery of CD&As just a more complex production process. And the fact is when you've got, when you're writing by committee, turf battles naturally happen. And what we've seen is that when compensation committees help determine who should lead the drafting and review process, it really does promote efficiency and minimize conflicts that can waste time. Lastly, as a managing editor, as I mentioned earlier, expectations are that CD&As are the voice of the committee. And so as a result, committees should really have a heavier hand in the editing process, simply to ensure that the narrative is clear on how and why the committee made its decisions. So let's take a quick look at how you can use content to your advantage as we start to wrap up. So we can go to the next slide, Ron, thanks. We're on slide 21. While there's no surefire way to ensure that your disclosure or your program is going to please every single person that takes a look at it, here are some guiding principles that we've learned that work really well for developing clear and meaningful content. The first is to make sure you're linking business and leadership strategy to your pay philosophy. It's critical to make the connections between what the business strategy is, why the leadership team is critical to executing on the strategy, in particular when you're dealing with retention issues, and how the executive pay program supports these fundamental business imperatives. The second is highlighting performance results and resulting pay outcomes. So while we know total shareholder return is one of the most meaningful measures of performance to shareholders, we know that it alone will not sell your story. Companies really do need to be more clear about the metrics and strategic initiatives on which executives are focused and held accountable, the ones that are expected to drive shareholder value in particular. People want to be clear on the milestones that were achieved and how those achievements were considered in the pay decisions, and we see more and more of that coming through. The next is be transparent about responses to shareholder feedback in your engagement efforts. We had a question come through about what exactly is an engagement effort, and what I'm talking about specifically is shareholder engagement process, your ongoing dialogue with your institutional shareholders. We know that everyone likes to be heard, especially unhappy investors and activist investors. So we really see companies taking the time to prioritize and outline their key feedback themes and have responses for each. So even if some themes are not addressed in a way that makes everyone happy, so maybe you heard something in your feedback but didn't make a particular change, maybe it's a performance measure or the way you're granting equity, people still need to hear and deserve a clear explanation of the actions that were taken or not and why. And finally, what brings us here today is to strike that perfect balance between compliance and communication, which we know is not easy to do. We just have got to a point where we're coming to terms with our audience's changing expectations, and while they know that we're all required to cover a standard checklist of issues, they really don't want to be mired down in technical and legal jargon. So we know we need to dot our I's and cross our T's and work together, but we also need to make sure that people are grasping what we mean and how what we're saying reflects the broader business and leadership strategies. You also just simply can't underestimate the extra credit you get for making things easier for all of your stakeholders to understand. So with that, as we're wrapping up, we're going to take one last poll. So we can flip to the poll, Ron. The question here is ensuring that our executive compensation disclosure is or are written in a reader-friendly manner has become equally important to ensuring that the content is technically accurate. So I'll give you a few moments to ponder that question, see where people come out on that. Ron, I'll let you take the lead on when you want to show the results, because I know we're running down on time. All right, we've got some consensus here that making things clear is important. So with that, if we turn to our final slides, I'd like to leave you with some inspiration from companies that have done a really good job in this past year of making their disclosures a little bit more clear and comprehensive at the same time. I will tell you, if I had $1 for each time someone asked me for examples of cool or great disclosures, I probably wouldn't be on the phone with you all. I'd be on an island somewhere drinking a margarita. But I get the question a lot. Anyway, I think what's important to note is that companies do a really good job in certain areas. I don't know that I've seen a really good end-to-end proxy statement or CD&A for that matter. But I think that companies have done a good job, like I said, in certain sections of their CD&A, specifically using content and graphics to their advantage. So the first example I have here is Honeywell. What they've done here, as you can see, is they use steps, which is a really nice approach and tactic to illustrate how paid decisions were made. In this instance, it's specific to their short-term incentive plan, which makes it very clear to see that there is a thoughtful process in the way the committee is making its decisions. If we can flip to the next slide, slide 23. What we have here is ExxonMobil. I'm sure you've all seen their disclosures over the years. They've set the bar very high. They've consistently done an exceptional job at showing how their CEO reported pay aligns with long-term total shareholder returns. They also show CEO reported pay versus realized pay because it's important to their business story. They use color, they use visuals, and I'm going to ask Ron to turn to our last example, which is United Technologies. What United Technologies does really nice here is they use bar charts to show how their TSR compares to that of their peers. They also use sound bites, very short sentences, to talk about their engagement efforts, what they heard, and how they responded. So I'm going to leave you all. I think our last slide brings us to the questions portion of this discussion. But what I will say is, obviously, the examples I've shown you here are very large companies with lots of resources to hire proxy production houses who can do some fancy graphics and colors and production. What I'm seeing now more and more is that smaller and mid-sized companies are able to do the same things without having to go through those methods. Many companies have internal corporate communications folks or human resources communicators who can help write content, who can develop charts and graphs in Word or PowerPoint and help guide content in a way so it's clear and do some editing and streamlining. So I leave you with that as just an idea as you head into what I'll call the early or the late side, the early side of late with respect to drafting your CD&A and how you might be able to challenge your folks who are writing to do a good job of making things clear. Back to you, Richard.
Thank you, ladies. Well done. I'd like to go very quickly into questions. We're just about out of time, unfortunately, but let me start. Most proxies that include an executive summary of compensation do that separate from the legal regulatory description normal for proxies. Should the two be combined, or should they be left separate?
So the question is whether executive summaries are separate from the CD&A?
Yes, as I understand it.
I mean, the way we typically see it is that we have a section called Compensation Discussion and Analysis, and we have different subsections within that CD&A. And the first subsection typically is the executive summary. And by nature of being in a CD&A, it's a document furnished and filed by the Compensation Committee. So I guess it becomes, if you will, a legal document.
Okay. Another question. This one will be an interesting one for me to hear you answer. What would be considered a good or acceptable pay ratio?
This is, I just have to answer with it depends because, that's a cop-out. But, I mean, really, we don't know what the definition of acceptable is until we see everything else. It's just a peer group analysis, and I don't think you could talk about it in the absolute. It's all going to be relative. And, I mean, really that's the extent to which any of it has any meaning, if it has any meaning at all. It's how do you compare your peers?
And so I'll lead that into our last question. We're really run out of time. And that was from someone who said, is NACD or somebody out there lobbying the SEC or Congress on the CEO pay ratio thing? It's meaningless.
It's meaningless, but been there, done that. It's already part of Section 954 of Dodd-Frank. It's too late. There were a few bills and that got through the House, but they sort of died on the vine, and it's here to stay, and there's really no use in fighting it anymore.
Thank you. I think that wraps it up. Let me refer our audience and participants to a couple of slides that are on page 30 and 30, or those are in the appendix, which you should go to. But the last two slides have some housekeeping issues, things on what you will get for credit and fellowship information, and also the next upcoming webinar, which will be on December the 16th, the Age of Alignment, Linking Compensation and Business Strategy. Again, thank you, everyone, for participating. Very much appreciated. I enjoyed it. I hope you did.